Of all the empires that ever rose and fell, none has captured the imagination of the world quite like Rome. Picture it. Marble cities glistening under the Mediterranean sun, legions marching in perfect formation, senators in flowing togas debating the fate of millions. For centuries, Rome was invincible, a colossus astride Europe, Africa, and Asia. And yet, it crumbled, not with a single mighty crash, but with a slow, almost imperceptible unraveling. The real story of how Rome fell isn't a clean, straight line. It's a messy, dramatic saga of greed, betrayal, climate change, and pandemics. It's a tragedy where the villains often thought they were heroes, and where the heroes sometimes made everything worse. Our story begins not at the end, but at Rome's height, the 2nd century AD. The empire was sprawling, rich, and powerful. The famed Pax Romana, or Roman peace, had bathed the Mediterranean in relative stability for nearly 2 centuries. Roads stretched like veins across the empire, bustling with trade. Amphitheaters roared with crowds, and villas overflowed with wine and exotic goods from distant lands. Rome, it seemed, was eternal, but beneath this glittering surface, cracks were already spidering through the foundation. One of the first tremors came not from an enemy's sword, but from within. Political instability was rife. After the death of the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, his son Commodus, a vain and brutal ruler, took the throne. While Marcus had spent his life meditating on duty and virtue, Commodus preferred gladiator games and extravagance. Some historians say this was the moment the empire began its slow decay, when self-interest started to eclipse civic responsibility at the very top. Meanwhile, outside Rome's walls, the world was shifting. Nomadic tribes beyond the Rhine and Danube were growing restless. The so-called barbarians were not the unwashed savages Roman propaganda made them out to be. Many were skilled warriors, traders, and farmers, pushed westward by pressures of their own. Climate change in Central Asia, population booms, and the terrifying advance of a mysterious new force, the Huns. In 165 AD, a shadow darker than any army crept across the empire: disease. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, swept through the population, killing perhaps 5 million people. In a world without germ theory, the plague seemed a punishment from the gods. Farms lay fallow, armies dwindled, confidence in Rome's invincibility cracked. And yet Rome staggered on. Fast forward to the 3rd century, and the empire was in freefall. Emperors came and went with dizzying speed, some lasting mere months. The year 238 alone saw 6 different emperors. Historians call this period the crisis of the 3rd century, and it was chaos. Inflation soared. Silver coins were debased until they were little more than tin trinkets. Local strongmen, sensing Rome's weakness, carved out their own mini-empires. At one point, the empire literally split into 3 competing states. How did Rome survive this? By reinventing itself? Brutally. Emperor Diocletian rose from humble origins to seize power in 284 AD. He brought order by turning the empire into a rigid, bureaucratic machine. He divided it into east and west to make governing easier. He even demanded to be worshipped like a living god to cement his authority. Diocletian stabilized the empire, yes, but at a cost. Taxes crushed the peasantry. Freedom dwindled. The empire had saved itself by becoming something colder, harder, less Roman. Still, the greatest blow was yet to come. In the early 5th century, Rome faced an enemy it could not bribe, bully, or absorb: Alaric the Visigoth. Raised among Romans but denied the respect he felt he deserved, Alaric turned his bitterness into rebellion. In 410 AD, his army sacked the city of Rome itself, the first time in 800 years. The shock was seismic. St. Jerome, a Roman scholar living in Bethlehem, wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." And yet, Rome still wasn't dead. The Western Roman Empire limped on for another 66 years. A hollow shell of its former self, it watched as provinces peeled away like autumn leaves. Britain was abandoned. Gaul fell to the Franks. Spain splintered into warring kingdoms. Italy itself became a battleground between Roman generals and barbarian warlords. Finally, in 476 AD, the last Roman emperor in the West, a teenager ironically named Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. No fanfare, no great battle, just a quiet end. The Senate sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor, as if to say, "We're done." But was that really the fall of Rome? Here's the twist. The Eastern Roman Empire, better known to us as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive for nearly 1,000 years after the so-called fall. Its capital, Constantinople, gleamed with palaces, churches, and markets long after the city of Rome itself had faded into ruins. Roman law, Roman art, Roman engineering all lived on. Even the idea of Rome lingered, haunting medieval kings and modern nations alike. Charlemagne crowned himself Emperor of the Romans. The Russians called themselves the Third Rome. Mussolini dreamed of a new Roman Empire. In a way, Rome never truly fell. It mutated, transformed, and echoed down the corridors of history, its ghost shaping the world we live in. So why do we cling to the story of a sudden collapse? Because it's dramatic. Because it warns us that even the greatest powers can vanish. Because it's easier and maybe a little comforting to imagine that civilizations fall with a bang, rather than a long, slow sigh of exhaustion. The real fall of Rome wasn't one moment, one battle, or one bad emperor. It was a centuries-long story of resilience and failure, adaptation and hubris. It was a civilization trying to hold on to greatness while the world changed around it, and ultimately losing its grip. Rome teaches us that no empire, no matter how mighty, is immune to the forces of time. And perhaps that's why, 2,000 years later, we still tell its story, still marvel at its ruins, still whisper about its fall, and wonder how much longer our own empires might endure. Imagine a world where a single city controlled over a quarter of the world's population, where the law could stretch from the green hills of Britain to the sands of the Sahara, where emperors commanded legions so powerful they could redraw the borders of civilization. That was Rome. And yet, despite all its power, all its glory, Rome fell. But not in the way you might think. The real story of the Roman Empire's fall isn't a single event, a dramatic last stand, or a lone act of betrayal. It's a slow, agonizing collapse stretched over centuries, a fall marked not by a single hammer blow, but by 1,000 tiny cuts. Our story begins not with Rome weakened and desperate, but at the height of its power. The 2nd century AD, the empire basked in the golden glow of the Pax Romana, a peace that seemed endless. Roman roads stitched the empire together, aqueducts poured clean water into bustling cities, and markets overflowed with silk, spices, and silver. The city of Rome itself was the beating heart of the known world. Marble temples, glittering palaces, and the Colosseum towering into the sky. Citizens lived under the rule of law, enjoyed free grain from the government, and marveled at the sheer order of it all. But even at its zenith, seeds of decay had been sown. When Emperor Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, he passed the throne to his son Commodus, a man obsessed with gladiatorial games, personal glory, and decadence. Commodus was no philosopher like his father. He preferred dressing up as Hercules and fighting in the arena, demanding statues of himself erected across the empire. Under his reign, the Senate was reduced to a rubber stamp, corruption flourished, and the army grew restless. It was as if Rome's elite had forgotten the virtues that built the empire: discipline, duty, sacrifice. Meanwhile, beyond Rome's borders, a storm was brewing. To the east, the mighty Parthian Empire waited for any sign of weakness. To the north, Germanic tribes, the Goths, Vandals, and Franks, watched hungrily. These weren't faceless hordes. They were sophisticated societies under intense pressure. Climate change in the Eurasian steppe had disrupted traditional food sources, pushing entire populations westward, closer to Roman lands. In 165 AD, the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, had erupted, killing up to a third of the population in some regions. Soldiers brought it home from campaigns abroad, and within a few years, the empire was gasping for breath. Farms were abandoned, tax revenues collapsed, legions shrank. Imagine it. Once bustling Roman villas standing empty, marketplaces silent, cities turning inward in fear of invisible death. Rome survived, barely, but it was never quite the same. The 3rd century was a nightmare. Between 235 and 284 AD, over 25 emperors reigned, almost all meeting violent ends. Soldiers often proclaimed their generals emperor. If they won a battle, they ruled. If they lost, they died. Assassination became a political tool. Civil wars drained the treasury. Inflation soared as coins were debased to pay restless armies. At its worst, entire regions peeled away. In the West, the so-called Gallic Empire, encompassing modern France, Britain, and Spain, broke off. In the East, the Palmyrene Empire, ruled by the dazzling Queen Zenobia, seized much of the eastern Mediterranean. For a time, it seemed the Roman world would shatter completely. But then, from the chaos, rose a savior, Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian knew that the old ways couldn't save Rome. He restructured the empire, dividing it into east and west, each ruled by an emperor and a deputy, a system called the Tetrarchy. He imposed strict economic controls and demanded near religious devotion to the emperor. It worked for a while. Yet this new Rome was fundamentally different, more authoritarian, more militarized, less Roman in spirit. Civic life withered, freedom eroded, and lurking in the shadows was a new force, Christianity. Christians had been persecuted for centuries, but by the early 4th century they were a growing force within the empire. In 312 AD, Constantine the Great claimed to see a vision of a Christian symbol in the sky before a decisive battle. He converted, and so too eventually did the empire. Rome had always prided itself on tradition, but now its spiritual heart shifted. Temples to Jupiter fell silent. Crosses appeared where eagles once stood. The empire was changing, and its enemies had noticed. In the late 4th century, a new terror rode in from the east. The Huns. No one knows exactly where the Huns came from. They seemed almost mythical. Fierce, fast, relentless horsemen who destroyed everything in their path. As they crashed into Europe, they drove Germanic tribes before them like waves before a storm. One of these tribes, the Visigoths, sought asylum within the Roman Empire. Desperate and hungry, they crossed the Danube in 376 AD. Roman officials, corrupt and arrogant, mistreated them, selling them dog meat at outrageous prices, abusing their women and children. The Visigoths revolted. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Roman Emperor Valens arrogantly rushed into battle without waiting for reinforcements. His army was annihilated. Valens himself burned to death inside a farmhouse where he had sought refuge. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, and a chilling sign that Rome could no longer rely on its once invincible legions. The empire stumbled on. It made deals with barbarian leaders, granting them land in exchange for military service. But these foederati were never fully under Roman control. They had their own ambitions, their own dreams. Enter Alaric, king of the Visigoths. Alaric had once fought for Rome. He knew its strengths and its weaknesses. When denied the rewards he felt he deserved, he turned his armies against the empire he had once served. In 410 AD, Alaric's forces surrounded Rome. Starvation gripped the city. The unthinkable happened. Mothers reportedly ate their own children. The Senate, desperate and broken, opened the gates. Alaric's men flooded in. For 3 days they plundered the eternal city. Churches were spared, a sign of lingering Christian reverence, but the psychological blow was shattering. Rome, the city that had ruled the known world, lay humiliated. Still, the empire staggered on. By the mid-5th century, the Western Empire was a ghost of its former self. Italy was ravaged by successive waves of invasions. North Africa, the empire's breadbasket, was lost to the Vandals. Spain and Gaul fractured into warring kingdoms. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, fared better. Its immense wealth, strong walls, and savvy diplomacy kept it alive, but the West was abandoned to its fate. In 455 AD, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. They stripped the city of its treasures, taking golden candlesticks from the Temple of Jerusalem, captured centuries earlier by Roman legions. Finally, in 476 AD, the curtain fell. A Germanic general, Odoacer, deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. Romulus was too young, too powerless to resist. Odoacer didn't bother pretending he was founding a new dynasty. He simply sent the imperial regalia to the Eastern Emperor and ruled Italy in his own name. No final battle, no heroic last stand, just a quiet end. The Western Roman Empire was dead. Or was it? Because in truth, Rome never truly disappeared. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, flourished for another millennium. Its people called themselves Romans until the very end. Roman law continued to shape Europe. Roman engineering marvels remained standing. Roman ideas about governance, citizenship, and empire lived on. Even after Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the dream of Rome endured. It lingered in the coronations of kings, the charters of new nations, the ambitions of conquerors, and even today, we live in a world shaped by Rome's shadow, in our languages, our laws, our architecture, and our dreams. So why does the myth of Rome's sudden fall persist? Because it's comforting. It gives us a story with a beginning, a middle, and a neat, tragic end. It offers a warning that even the greatest empires can fall, not through one catastrophic failure, but through generations of slow, grinding decline. And perhaps it reminds us of something even more unsettling. That collapse often comes not with a scream, but with a sigh. Not when the walls are stormed, but when the people inside no longer believe enough to defend them. The Roman Empire teaches us that no power, however mighty, is eternal. It whispers across the centuries, a ghostly voice warning us to look carefully at the cracks beneath our own shining civilizations. Because sometimes the end doesn't look like the barbarians at the gates. Sometimes it looks like business as usual, right until the moment the walls fall in.